Welcome back, Urban Explorers, to Season 2.
Season 2 already.
I know, right? It feels like just yesterday we were wrapping up Season 1, but here we are ready to dive back into the fascinating world of cities with all of you.
I'm excited.
Me too, especially to all our listeners in the Philippines, the USA, and Russia. You guys are seriously the best. Thanks for sticking with us.
Yeah, shout out to all our urban explorers around the globe.
So to kick things off, I got to tell you about this crazy thing that happened to me on my way to the studio today.
What happened? You get caught in another one of those New York downpours?
Worse, actually. Well, maybe not worse, but definitely weirder.
All right, I'm intrigued. You got to tell me.
So picture this. I'm walking down the street minding my own business when all of a sudden,
A marching band.
right out of nowhere, this full-on marching band takes over the entire sidewalk instruments, blaring people cheering. It was like a scene from a movie.
Only in New York, right? It's never a dull moment. Speaking of never a dull moment.
Oh, you think that's a good transition to today's discourse?
I do actually, because just like that marching band, cities are constantly changing, evolving.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So are you saying we're going to talk about city planning and how cities handle those kinds of unexpected events?
Not exactly, although that's an interesting topic for another time. Today we're going to be focusing on something a little more specific, building height regulations.
Okay, building height regulations. Now that sounds a little wry.
Trust me, it's more exciting when you might think, because it's about way more than just how tall buildings can be. It's about the character of a city, the balance between growth and preservation, the needs of residents, the views from your window, even the amount of sunlight that hits the street.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, so we're going to put on our urbanist glasses and examine why a city might want to control how high buildings can go.
And what happens when those regulations are challenged or even broken? We'll look at examples from all over the world, starting with a case study from Tuncurry, Australia.
Australia. Now that's a change of pace from the concrete jungle of New York.
Exactly. This is a story that shows how, even in a relatively small coastal town, decisions about building height can spark major controversy.
All right, I'm all ears. Paint me a picture of Tuncurry. What kind of place are we talking about?
Imagine a beautiful coastal town known for its beaches, its relaxed vibe. And then imagine a developer proposing an 11-story building right in the middle of it all.
Whoa, 11 stories. That sounds pretty tall, especially for a small town.
It was definitely a bold proposal, and it immediately sparked a lot of debate because it would have been way taller than anything else in Tuncurry.
So what happened? Did they let them build this skyscraper by the sea?
Not so fast. The MidCoast Council, the local governing body, ultimately rejected the proposal.
Why'd they say no?
Well, they had a few major concerns. The first was the sheer height of the building. It would have dwarfed everything else in the town and really changed its character.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a big deal, especially in a place that's known for its low-key vibe.
They were also worried about the potential impact on the environment, things like increased traffic congestion and strain on the town's infrastructure.
Makes sense. You can't just plunk a huge building down somewhere without thinking about those things.
And lastly, they were concerned about setting a precedent. If they allowed this one building to go up, who's to say that other developers wouldn't come in and propose even taller buildings?
Ah, the domino effect. So they decided to nip it in the bud.
Exactly. But here's where things get interesting. Just a year later, they approved a different building that was actually even taller.
Really? So what was the deal with that?
This one was a 16.1-meter shop-top apartment block, which is basically a building with shops on the lower levels and apartments above. It was proposed for a different part of Tuncurry called Wharf Street.
Okay, but still taller than the one they rejected. How did that happen?
That's where the controversy comes in. The way the height limits were written, there were some loopholes. Developers could get creative with how they calculated the height. Sometimes certain features like lift structures weren't included in the total height.
So it wasn't just about how tall the building actually was, but how you measured it?
Exactly. And some people saw this approval as a way of getting around the intended height limits.
Oh, so it wasn't just about the height of the building, it was about fairness and transparency.
Exactly. And it led to a lot of debate about whether the council was playing favorites or whether the rules needed to be clarified.
This whole thing sounds like a bit of a headache.
It definitely highlights the complexities of these decisions, and it shows how passionate people can be about preserving the character of their town.
Yeah, I bet. So, okay, we've got this drama unfolding in a small town in Australia, but what does it all mean for our urban explorers in other parts of the world?
That's a great question, and it brings us to a key takeaway.
Hit me with it.
This example from Tuncurry shows that building height regulations are about so much more than just aesthetics. It's about preserving a sense of place, protecting the environment, and making sure that development happens in a way that benefits the entire community.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
And whether you live in a bustling metropolis or a quiet coastal town, these decisions about building height can have a real impact on your life.
I'm definitely starting to think about the buildings in my own neighborhood a little differently now.
That's the idea. And as we move on to explore other examples from around the world, keep this in mind, building height is about more than just skylines. It's about the very fabric of a city and the lives of the people who live there.
All right, urban explorers, buckle up. We're just getting started.
Welcome back to the Urbanist's Lens, Urban Explorers, that Tuncurry story, huh?
Yeah, wild stuff. Never thought building height could get so intense.
It gets people fired up because it's not just about height, right? It's all these other things we talked about.
Protecting that small town feel, making sure development doesn't go crazy.
Exactly. And different cities, they handle this whole thing in their own way. Like, think about Washington, D.C.
Oh yeah, all those monuments and government buildings. Pretty iconic skyline.
And it stayed pretty much the same for over a century, thanks to this law they passed back in 1910, the Height of Buildings Act.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want some skyscraper blocking the view of the Capitol building or the Washington Monument.
Right. It was all about preserving those views, keeping that sense of history. But of course, there's always another side to the story.
There's got to be, right? What are the downsides to keeping things so strict?
Well, some folk argue that it's actually made D.C. harder to live in, less housing options, so prices go up.
Ah, the affordability issue. We've talked about that before.
Yep. And then there's the whole economic development thing. Some say those height limits kind of stifle growth.
So it's a trade-off then. You get the historical charm, but maybe sacrifice some affordability and dynamism?
You got it. Each city has to figure out what works for them. Like, compare D.C. with Paris.
Ah, Paris, the city of lights. I remember being blown away by how elegant all the buildings looked, all kind of uniform in height.
That's no accident. Paris has been super careful about their skyline for centuries. Height limits are a big part of it.
But I bet even Paris has to adapt, right? The world's changing, cities are growing.
You're right on the money. Paris has been dealing with a housing shortage lately. Plus, they need more office space and updated infrastructure.
So are they starting to rethink their approach to building heights?
They are. They're dipping their toes in, exploring ways to maybe allow for taller buildings in certain areas, but doing it carefully so they don't mess up the overall vibe of the city.
Sounds like a tough balancing act.
It is, but that's what urban planning is all about, finding that sweet spot. And you know what plays a huge role in all this? Zoning.
Zoning. Remind me what exactly that is again?
Sure. Zoning's basically how cities divide up their land, like different districts, each with its own set of rules. Those rules cover stuff like building height, how dense things can be, what activities are allowed, all that.
So like you might have a zone for skyscrapers downtown, another for mid-rise apartments in a residential area, and another for protecting historic buildings.
Bingo. It's about creating a framework, so the city develops in a way that makes sense, different areas serving different purposes.
But these zoning rules aren't set in stone, are they? Cities change, needs change.
You're absolutely right. They can change, but it's got to be done the right way. Public process, input from residents, developers, city officials, everyone has a say.
So it's not just some top-down decision. People actually get to influence how their city grows.
Exactly. Public engagement is super important. Cities use all sorts of tools to gather input, public hearings, community meetings, design review boards, that kind of thing.
So it's a collaborative thing, not just architects and developers calling all the shots.
Right. Because at the end of the day, cities are for people, right? The goal is to create vibrant, livable spaces, places where communities can thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So bring you back to D.C. and Paris, there are different approaches. What are the big lessons here for our urban explorers?
The big one is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for this building height thing. Every city's got to find its own path based on its own unique circumstances and goals.
And it sounds like it often boils down to striking a balance.
Yep, weighing the pros and cons, like you said earlier, growth versus preservation, aesthetics versus affordability, meeting the needs of residents today versus thinking about the future.
So those decisions, they're not just about picking one option over another. It's about understanding the consequences of each choice.
Exactly, and that's why it's so crucial to have these open, honest conversations about the trade-offs so that cities can make informed decisions that truly reflect what their communities want.
Makes me think about my own neighborhood here in New York. There's this plan to redevelop an old industrial area a few blocks from me. Lots of back and forth about what should go there, how tall the buildings should be, how it'll affect everyone who lives nearby.
Classic urban dilemma shows how real this stuff is, how it affects people's everyday lives, the field of their neighborhood.
No doubt. So as we wrap up this part of our discourse, I want to throw this out to our urban explorers. What kind of city do you want to live in? What trade-offs are you willing to make?
Big questions. and worth thinking about because the choices we make today shape the cities of tomorrow.
Wow, I feel like we've covered so much ground today.
We have, from Tuncurry to D.C. to Paris, talk about a whirlwind tour of urban planning.
But it's been fascinating, right? Seeing how different cities approach this whole building height thing.
It really shows that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
No magic formula for the perfect city skyline.
Exactly. Every city has to find its own balance.
Between growth and preservation history, and modernity aesthetics and practicality.
And, most importantly, between the needs of the people and the vision for the future.
So for our urban explorers out there, the ones who might not be architects or city planners, what's the big takeaway from all of this?
It's about seeing your city with new eyes.
What do you mean?
Like next time you're walking down the street, look up, notice the buildings around you, their heights, their styles, how they relate to each other.
Okay, I can do that.
Ask yourself, why do those buildings look the way they do? What were the decisions that shaped that particular streetscape?
And how do those decisions affect my experience of the city?
Exactly. It's about becoming more aware of the built environment and the forces that shape it.
So it's not just about admiring a beautiful building or complaining about a new development. It's about understanding the context.
And realizing that you have a role to play in shaping that context.
Through things like community involvement, attending public hearings, speaking up about your vision for the city.
Because the city is constantly evolving, and every decision about building height zoning infrastructure, it all contributes to that evolution.
So we're not just passive observers. We can actually be active participants in shaping the urban landscape.
That's the power of the urbanist lens.
I like that. So urban explorers, here's your homework. Go out and observe your city with fresh eyes.
Notice the details. Ask questions. Start conversations.
And most importantly, think about what kind of city you want to live in. What trade-offs are you willing to make?
Because ultimately, the future of our cities is in our hands.
Thanks for joining us on this urban adventure. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the fascinating world of city life. Until then, keep exploring.